Hi, welcome to this segment where we shift our focus to the planning for an engineering design project. I call it designing your design process. Now, as I indicated earlier, these segments are organized more based on categories rather than focusing primarily on a prescribed sequence of steps. This is because of the various differences from one project to another, many of which I've alluded to along the way, including, of course, which aspects are going to need to be reiterated and to what extent and in what manner. Now, I'm covering this after having introduced those major substantive aspects of the process, because I think it makes more sense to talk about this now that you'll know what I'm referring to. But in practice, at least some sort of planning needs to be begun early on in your process. Planning out the various tasks needed to properly manage your design process and reiterating your planning of those tasks as needed along the way based on various circumstances are in fact part of your design process. Very meta. Now, despite all the caveats about how variable and nonlinear the process can be, at an abstract level, most formulations of the process tend to share some common major elements, as we discussed earlier. So, at least as a starting point, it can be helpful to begin our planning by thinking about those common major steps and, at a very high level, for now at least, a typical sequence that can guide us initially before we proceed to add the various details like specific tasks that are unique to your project and any expected iterations that we can anticipate likely to need as of wherever we are in the process. So, you could say that the process tends to have just a whiff of linearity. Sometimes, specific portions of a given design cycle will get reiterated in small loops, if you will, to varying degrees, in addition to iterations for much or most or all of the cycle, or large loops or full loops, if you will. Sometimes a reiteration isn't even really a loop at all, but just repeating a certain task within a certain stage. In any case, everything you do should be informed as much as possible by whatever you've done so far in the project and have been able to learn from that. Some projects lend themselves to better overall visibility than others, or predictability, at least for certain parts of the process. Now, that often depends on the particular type of product being designed and whether you're doing a routine sort of design or something more novel. So, of course, your process is going to be much more structured than any general description of the process because it will naturally reflect your particular project and circumstances. However, some of that structure won't be fully fleshed out right away, and some of what does get fleshed out will end up needing to change. There are three main aspects of project management: scope, schedule, and budget. For engineering design projects, scope is largely determined, in effect, by your design requirements. Sometimes those do need to be managed in a sense by being revisited periodically, as we mentioned when covering requirements. However, scope is somewhat broader than requirements in the sense that requirements tend to be somewhat more detailed. So minor changes there won't necessarily change your scope. Also reflected in project scope are project requirements that are not necessarily part of design requirements. For example, there may be stipulated dates for progress reports or key milestones, such as a first testbed prototype. There may also be specific expectations or limitations that constrain how you approach your process, perhaps regarding location, equipment, personnel, or other resources. Another factor is that with a real-life project, In the sense of something you'd be looking to implement for actual use, there are, of course, additional steps to consider beyond developing and prototyping the design. For example, if it's a physical item that would be replicated and sold, the project's scope would include tasks for pursuing a path to manufacturing, as well as planning a design transfer from the development team to the manufacturing team. For software products, it could include planning for maintenance like bug fixes and updates that will inevitably be needed after the product is released. In any case, we're not really getting into post-prototype development here, but just be mindful of that. Okay, now, aside from the scope of your project, other aspects of project management include scheduling and budgeting. Who has responsibility for those things can vary a lot. In some settings, a member of the development team may have primary responsibility for managing the overall project. It might be a senior member of the team with an operations background or simply a lot of experience with similar projects. Who that person reports to and what sorts of business constraints there may be are yet additional variables. In educational contexts, student project teams often aim to operate by consensus so that all students can share in a similar experience. But in most workplace situations, decision-making authority and accountability are often allocated differently. In our next lesson, we'll talk about identifying and scheduling whatever particular tasks will be involved for your project.